I'm here today with Professor David Albert Jones. He's a director of the Anscombe Bioethics Center. He's a professor of ethics, bioethics, and he's somebody who's been working at these issues for very many years. So actually, I should actually first ask you more about Anscombe and have you say a few words about that before we begin our actual topic today, David.
Thank you. So the Anscombe Bioethics Centre is an independent centre for medical ethics. It's based in Oxford, though it's not part of Oxford University. And I might say, though I am attached to Oxford University and I'm a professor at a different university, St Mary's in Twickenham in London. So I have more than one hat. So the Anscombe Centre was founded in 1977. It's the oldest medical ethics centre for medical ethics in the United Kingdom, and is affiliated to the Catholic Church. I should say that because this is often used against me. So it's good to be clear from the beginning. But we work very often with people from different faiths and with people from no faith on this issue and on other issues.
That's exactly it. I've noticed that when you're publishing a paper or when you're making commentary, that your commentary is more oriented towards the wider audience. Not to say that it doesn't deal with a faith perspective at times also, but it is oriented towards a wider audience, and I do appreciate that because I think that in this pluralistic culture, that's very important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I
So
think speaking as the perspective in England is perhaps different than it might be in certainly in Ireland, but even I think in Australia or Canada, we're less than 10% Catholic population. So there is no way in which we could dominate the culture. So anything that we say has to be framed as one constituency among others, as one voice among others, trying to appeal to evidence and trying to work within a pluralistic society.
no, I think you do that. I think you've been very good at that, and that's why one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation with you. And I think this is a very important time, especially because at the time of this recording, the assisted suicide bill in the UK and England and Wales. I know there's one also in Scotland that's going to also be debated. Whether that gets delayed or not, we'll see what happens. Has currently been delayed by a few weeks by Kim Leadbeater, and so it's expected that it might be voted on in June. I know there's timetables, but everything's sort of up in the air a little bit considering how
Mm-hmm.
big the topic is and the kind of changes. But can you sort of tell people really what is the case right now with this situation with the Leadbeater assisted suicide bill in England and
Yeah, so the Leadbeater bill is a private member's bill. It was introduced in October. It passed its second reading, which is usually the most difficult thing to get through. So it passed its second reading, not overwhelmingly, but strongly enough. And it's then gone to committee. There's been a committee which has been looking at it, and it will now go to report stage. The report stage is due on the 16th of May. There may be a vote on third reading on the 16th of May, or that might be put back to June. So there is a bill which has passed at least one vote in the House of Commons, which is more than any other bill on this topic has done in the House of Commons before. And so there's a real possibility, a real danger, a real opportunity, depending on what side of the debate you're on, that this might pass into law. When it goes from the Commons, it would go to the House of Lords. The House of Lords has an opportunity to amend it, but it's very difficult for the Lords to throw out a bill. And a complicating factor is that the government has signalled its willingness to support this to the extent of giving people time for the debate to happen. In theory, they're neutral, but the Prime Minister is in fact in favour. And that probably influences a lot of MPs.
I have been writing about Keir Starmer for many years because he was your director of public prosecutions many years
Indeed.
ago, and so so I'm well aware of his strong support for assisted suicide, euthanasia. So it doesn't surprise me that his government would be strongly supportive then of this bill. In fact, in a sense, it makes it easier on him that it be a private member's bill, even though it might be harder to get a private member's bill through how parliamentary system works.
In this country, bills on this kind of topic are nearly always private members' bills. There's a even the Abortion Act and abortion and euthanasia are obviously very different topics from one point of view, but in terms of their controversial nature, they're similar. That was passed in 1967 in the UK. It was a private member's bill. The government was obviously in favour and shepherded it through, but it was a private member's
Right.
bill.
Yeah.
And I think that therefore that was always likely to be the case. If we had legislation in this country, it was likely to be from a private member's bill. Another thing which is might not be obvious from outside the UK is the way in which the current parliament is constituted. Most MPs in this parliament have never been MPs before the last election.
Right.
So
53%, I think.
most MP, and this is, and I think the second largest. I think the only one larger was I think just after the Second World War. So this very large influx of people who are relatively naive about parliamentary process. Most of them Labour backbenchers. Most of them very um, grateful to the Prime Minister for their jobs, for the fact that the Labour Party has a large majority. So if you look at the people who were there more than a year, the people who were there before the last election,
the last election, yeah.
most MPs voted against the bill. And that's not just true of Conservatives. That's also true within the Lib Dems, and it's also true within the Labour Party. It's the new intake who have been persuaded to allow this through, and that's very frustrating because I think there's a degree of naivety about this process, which is particularly dangerous because, as we both know, once you start down this road, all kinds of things happen.
Right.
And I think so you've got people who've only just arrived in Parliament and they don't realise what power they have to open a door that they won't be able to close, and people after them will just push further open.
So we've had this discussion, you and I, about how the bill is a type of an Oregon style bill. Now, what do I mean by that? It's claims to be limited to assisted suicide in its language. It definitely seems to be. Yet it's written in a funny way, as I've said to you. It's a funny sort of bill how it's written. It has a 6-month provision. You have to determine that someone's within a 6-month prognosis to death, which is very hard to determine anyway. But they come up with that to say, oh, but you have to be terminally ill, 6-month prognosis. And yet at the same time, I've mentioned to you many times about the nature of the bill. When I look at Canada, now we have euthanasia and assisted suicide. Now, euthanasia and assisted suicide, as you know, they differentiate, but not in their intention or their outcome. They differentiate in how the act is carried out, right? In euthanasia, the doctor or nurse practitioner, in Canada, it's nurse practitioners also that are directly involved in the act, will actually do the act. They actually either inject you or they are the one killing you, whether it's an IV use or whether it's a syringe. Whereas assisted suicide, they would prescribe you the same lethal poison and you would take it yourself. So that's the differentiation, how it's taken. But the British, the England and Wales bill that you're talking about, it is assisted suicide. And I thought you should maybe comment a bit on that, how the bill is and what it says.
So the first bill on this matter to be presented before Parliament was in 1936, the Voluntary Euthanasia Legalisation Bill, and that was a euthanasia bill. And then subsequent attempts in 1950 and 1969 and 1992 and 1997 and 2003 and 2005 were also euthanasia bills. But what's happened in the last 20 years is basically they've been trying to hone down the thin end of the wedge, so it's thinner and thinner, so they can get something on the statute. Once it gets on the statute, then the movement can go back to where it started, which is euthanasia. So I think that the most people who were involved on the other side are in fact in favor of euthanasia, but they have been trying and this is, I think, quite like Oregon back in the 1990s, and quite like Victoria in 2017. They've been adding lots of safeguards, trying to narrow it in order to say that's all you have to sign up for. If you do this, it won't go any further. Though in fact, most of the people who are saying that actually would quite like it to go further.
Right, exactly. Well, we see that in the US, as you know. In the US, they have 10 states and one jurisdiction that have legalized assisted suicide. And in nearly every state, they've expanded their law. So even if you look at Oregon, and I know they're constantly saying, oh, the Oregon law, it looks how safe it is. The Oregon law has also expanded. The Washington state law expanded. Colorado expanded. They've almost all of them. I say almost all of them because New Mexico was the last bill that passed and became law. That was in 2020. And that bill was actually the widest bill in the US. It's the widest, assisted suicide law. So it's harder to expand a wide law. And as you know, in California, the big issue right now is whether or not they should allow for euthanasia. And of course, they've been holding back because they have a problem that if California debates a euthanasia bill, then obviously in Massachusetts and Illinois and all these other states that have been debating assisted suicide for umpteen years, New York, for instance, which is a massive state population-wise, then it'd be harder for them to pass their assisted suicide bill, for instance, in New York, if they were to pass a euthanasia bill in California, because they would say, well, no, I don't think that's where we want to go, right? So, it's been this game, and I predict, of course, the same thing will happen in the UK, and that's how I look at it. I think it's sort of inevitable.
I think how I read what happened or is happening in the States is that because it's state by state, essentially the main aim of people who are campaigning about this issue is for it to be a national law. That's really what they want. And so for 10 years nobody joined Oregon. Oregon was on its own. And then when somebody joined it, who was it? It was Washington next door, so that's hardly an expansion. And then still nobody else was joining. But then you started to have movement. I think the essential shift, the pivot, was California, because California is just so big. And after California adopted a similar law, then you had Colorado, and you had a group of people, and then you had the sense of, well, now we have a critical mass. Now we don't have to behave ourselves as we did before. Now we can start also giving a little bit of elbow room to people who want to push. And so between 1997 and 2019, no changes in any law. And then from 2019 to the present, 7 changes across 6 states.
Yeah,
So essentially, we've moved into a different phase. We've moved into the right now. We've got enough critical mass. We still want to be trying to persuade people that we're not changing, but in fact, we're actually going into a different business, which is
and the removal of in the US, the removal of the residency requirement has made a major shift, even though the numbers have not massively shifted yet. It's beginning. For instance, in Oregon and Vermont and New Mexico, you don't have to be a citizen of those states to die in that state by assisted suicide. Therefore, you're seeing this change going on that way, where it's becoming national in a sense that way, by opening the door to these states. But I don't think we could join this call to have
sorry.
About the US. Anyway, in the UK, you wrote an excellent paper recently that you published about the Australian influence, because it's something I noticed clearly early on in the debate that you guys were having. There was quite a bit of reference to Canada, and because we've had quite a few almost ridiculous stories out of Canada, people either dying by assisted suicide, euthanasia, or being pressured towards euthanasia.
Yes.
And and it was just like beyond what people would accept in a situation. Now, what am I saying? When we're debating a bill, they want you to think that this is going to be very tight. So
Yes.
making reference to cases that are really outside of that sphere, they don't want to talk about. So in fact, as you pointed out, they've now been focusing in the UK on Australia because it's a much younger law and it hasn't quite widened yet.
Yes, well, though in fact it has massively, though nobody seems to have twigged this. So the very curious thing in the debate, both in the in England and Wales and in Scotland, is it's been they in both places they have relied very heavily on witnesses from Australia and said Australia is really the model we're following, even though Australia also has euthanasia. So
Okay.
Australia is not Oregon. It's already broader, but not only is it already broader between the different states, it's become broader and broader and broader. So Victoria, it was
They were the
not
first state, yeah. Yeah.
there was which was the first date, 2017, came into effect 2019. So they said, well, 6 months, but not everybody. It's a 6 months requirement, but some things are rather difficult to diagnose. So we'll have an exception. So 6 months, but an exception for neurodegenerative diseases. And we'll say it has to be self-administered, but then not everybody is able to self-administer. So we'll have an exception. So we are following Oregon for 6 months and for self-administration, but we have an exception for neurodegenerative and an exception for if you can't physically do it.
Right.
What happens, but the next state along is Western Australia. They passed their law even before the Victoria law comes into effect.
Right.
Well, a couple of months after it comes into effect, but before we have any data at all. So
Right.
this is not on the basis of any evidence of what's happened, because nothing has happened as yet, but they already open the door further. So they say, well, maybe you have some people who physically are incapable, but you also have some people who simply it doesn't suit them, or they're psychologically it's difficult for them, and so it should be at the discretion of the doctor. So no longer is it just those who physically can't do it. And also in Victoria, they said the doctor
They can't bring it up.
can't bring it up, can't
Yeah.
initiate the
Yeah.
conversation. If it's supposed to be autonomy, it's not about the doctor's autonomy. It's supposed to be about the patient's autonomy, which means that it's for the patient to decide whether they want the doctor to bring it up. Thank you very much. And that was in Victoria. In Western Australia, already they had dropped that. Not on the basis of evidence, because there was no evidence, but on the basis that the ball had started rolling. And then a couple of years later in Queensland, they say, well, you say 6 months for most diseases, but 12 months for neurodegenerative. Well, let's be fair about this, and let's just say 12 months for everybody.
Right.
Yeah. And then a year later in the Australian Capital Territory, they say, what is all this months business anyway? And where they end up is where Canada was in 2016,
Right.
is a notion of end of life, but one which is so broadly drawn that in fact it's way open to people who have long-term chronic conditions.
Right. One of the changes I think that you may have noticed, but the role of Jocelyn Downey in Australia, I don't know if you've noticed that, but she was heavily involved in the later Australian legislation. So this whole concept of a 6 month or a 12-month sort of, you know, situation wouldn't have made sense to her because if you look at the Canadian law, there is no definition. The original law said that your natural death had to be reasonably foreseeable, but it wasn't defined. And it's nothing personal, David, but I think all of our natural deaths are reasonably foreseeable. So it really
Yes,
wasn't. So the limit was not based on a legal sort of parameter which you could define. The limit was based upon how comfortable the doctor was with approving your death or not. That's what the limit was, really. And then, of course, they got rid of that. as you know, in Canada, and that opened the door to people who not only have no terminal condition, but then obviously to make it fair, you have to then consider people because what was remaining in the law was an irremediable medical condition. So that's what we've gone to Canada. What is an irremediable medical condition? Well, there's a lot of us who have irremediable medical conditions.
Yes.
We're not dying in any way. And if we're having a really bad time of it, such as a person with disability who's living on a disability benefit, who can't afford the rent that they're having to pay, can't have to go to a food bank for food, and seem to find themselves on the outside of society, whether that be socially or whatever that might be in the sense. Some of these people are saying, I can't live like this any longer. Well, then they would qualify because they have an
Yes.
irremediable medical condition. And this is where Canada's gone.
I
So
think
I'm agreeing with you that Australia's moved that way. Absolutely.
yeah, and I think you're right about Jocelyn Downey and other voices from Canada, but also there were voices from Belgium, because Belgium is another player in this, because Belgium strongly influenced Quebec,
Yes.
and through Quebec, I think the rest of Canada, and Belgium also was particularly in the relationship between palliative care and assisted dying, as they call it, and a notion of an integrated vision
Right.
of that. That's essentially a Belgian vision. I mean, I don't think outside Belgium you don't get people who which is so led by palliative care. This notion of euthanasia and palliative care really as a single discipline almost, as you do with Bernheim and Lou Deliens and others in Belgium. So you've had this influence from Belgium and Canada on Australia, but now it's moving back, so that Australian academics are now talking to people in Belgium and to people in Canada about how they might improve what I think what they want to call the evidence base, but essentially a political program to push a view which is closer to Canada, which is itself getting closer to Belgium.
Right.
So I think that there are the real connections here. And the irony, I think, from a UK point of view, is that Australia is being set up as though it's it's just like America, but with a slightly different accent and a bit more Brit-like, and because of Commonwealth and all the rest of it. But in fact, the direction of travel in Australia very clearly is in a Canadian direction, and
Right.
behind that in a Belgian direction.
Yeah, and I actually agree with your analysis 150% about how Belgium influenced the Quebec. Like I wrote about that years ago when Quebec was debating euthanasia. Now, maybe the listeners don't realize that in fact Canada has two laws. We've got the Quebec law and we've got the federal law, and they're not the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. In fact, in Quebec, assisted suicide is still prohibited, whereas euthanasia is not prohibited. Of course, euthanasia is legal and rapidly promoted.
Mhm.
What makes Quebec a little different, though, is that emphasis on euthanasia as healthcare, because that's how they legalized it. They said that this was a form of healthcare, and the reason they did that, of course, was because they were trying to come up with a provincial model, which they would of course call a national model, but a provincial model. And in Quebec, of course, when you look at our division of powers, Quebec, like all provinces of Canada, have control over healthcare. They do not have control over the criminal code. So you understand that's where they went, and it's exactly it. Now I'm concerned about the UK because they seem to be under this notion that this is going to be really tight and we're going to keep it this way and
Yes.
the rest of it, and they're ignoring Canada and they're saying, oh, we're not going to be like Canada. And when I was speaking in the UK, I made it very clear to them, well, that's exactly what happened in Canada. It's identical to what happened in Canada. In Canada, we were told over and over and over again by our, liberal government, which had a majority at the time, that we're not going to be like the Netherlands or Belgium. We're not going to be like that. It's not going to be like that. Canada is going to be very different from that. And if you look at what happened, of course, it not only isn't very different than that, in some ways, not in all ways, in some ways, Canada's gone much further.
Yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree, and I also think from a UK perspective, of course, Canada Australia and New Zealand are culturally the countries in the world that are closest to the UK in terms of law and history and healthcare and a vision of healthcare. Because I think that in some ways, um, there's a Latin tag, corruptio optima pessima est. The corruption of the best is the worst. And I think that what you have in Canada and in Australia is because there is a commitment to healthcare as a public good that ought to be supported by the state, that when euthanasia gets identified with that, then the state becomes a major engine pushing people to consider ending their lives.
Right.
Whereas in America, where healthcare is still to a large extent privatized or mixed economy of various kinds, it's still thought of as an individual judgment. I mean, and that might be a problem of a free-for-all, but you don't have much. The state is not trying to encourage it in order to save money, is not trying to do it as part of its strategy for public health. It's not. I mean, there are a few people like that in the States, but it basically doesn't. It doesn't wash because it's so it's alien to the culture there. So the culture, which is problematic for healthcare in general, is quite helpful for inhibiting euthanasia or assisted suicide. Whereas what's happened in Canada and Australia is, it's become almost like childhood vaccination or something. It's something that the government should just roll out across the whole country because it's good for people, and the experts have decided it's good for people, and they've decided it's part of healthcare, and so why not encourage it? Why not have a doctor say, well, have you thought of this? I think it would help you very much if you
In fact,
end
the
your life.
doctor is almost mandated to bring it up when somebody has a medical condition which is likely to qualify, because they are saying that you have a right to your health care and you have a right to know all your options. So therefore, this has been a big problem where a lot of doctors who would say, I don't agree with killing people, so therefore that is not part of my practice. I'm not. They're the ones who are being pressured in the system, and it's not always even a subtle pressure. It's often an overt pressure in the system that they must bring it up. They don't have to do it. They'll say you don't have to do it, but you must bring it up because it's these people's option, and it's their legal right. And in fact, the interesting thing about it, I don't know if you've ever really read the Carter decision or the Canadian law in its full. I'm sure you've read the Canadian law, etc. But we don't actually have a right to euthanasia in Canada, even though Jocelyn Downey and the euthanasia lobby want you to believe you do. You don't actually have that. But because it's been accepted by the government who listened to the euthanasia lobby people, it's basically believed to exist, even though it really doesn't exist. So it's a problematic situation. But if you're told as a doctor, you must do this, like in Ontario. Ontario is the biggest province in Canada by a long shot. 39% of Canadians live in Ontario. The Ontario College of Physicians says you have an obligation to refer someone,
Yes.
for euthanasia, for MAID.
So the bill in Westminster, one of the ways in which they've tried to narrow it, but not quite please everyone, is they've said they haven't gone as far as Victoria did in 2017, and said that doctors shouldn't raise it, but they have said that doctors don't have to raise it.
Right.
Now, but at the same time, they seem to allow doctors to do so if at their discretion. This is a compromise, but it is a very funny kind of compromise. So the Medical Defence Union, which is a kind of legal body that represents doctors to try to prevent them from being sued, they don't like it because they say, no, it's no good saying you don't have a duty to do it, but you can do it. Because if you do it and somebody turns around and is upset and say, why have you done this? You can't say, I'm doing it because I have a medical duty to do it.
Right.
that option is ruled out for you because you don't have any, because the law says you don't have any. So if you don't, you're not saying it out of a duty. Why are you saying it? You're saying it because you happen to want to introduce the topic. You can't be saying it because it's a medical duty, because that's
No,
so.
that's
Uh,
right.
so from the medical defense union's point of view, either you should say you're required to do it, or you say you're not forbidden from doing it. But to say you're not, you don't have to do it, but you can if you like, brings the, so what does if you like mean? Well, what is this discretion if it's not duty,
I
if
know.
it's not medical duty, what is it?
Well, it actually gives cover, I would say, to the doctor who does bring it up because they can bring it up. They're not being told they shouldn't bring it up. It's just that they don't have a duty to bring it up. So it gives them a cover if they did bring it up. You can't legally go after someone, or you can't morally or anything go after someone or slap them on the wrist for doing something that they're legally allowed to do. Yeah, but I will say something else.
Except that if you do something, you can do things that you're allowed to do, but if they have bad consequences, then what's your defense if the bad consequences happen? So you say it
Well,
to somebody, then their relatives then complain, and then they bring a case, and then you want a defense, and for your defense, you want something more than, well, I'm allowed to do this. That's not a defense against harm.
the problem is that who has the legal right to put in an official complaint? And family might be upset, but the biggest
Mhm.
thing is that the person who was being treated is the one who would be more likely in a situation. The one seeking medical treatment being told this would be the one who
Mhm.
has the greater rights. And yet, if they actually take the doctor up on it, then they're dead. I always talk about euthanasia, why it's so problematic. Like I've had so many stories come my way where I'm talking to the family members so upset with what happened to mom, to dad, to brother, to sister, to friend,
Mhm.
and they're talking about it, and these are horrific stories. And you say, "Well, I would like to. Can we publish a story?" Well, I have to think about that. That's pretty difficult, I'll be, saying things. My family members probably won't like it, and that sort of thing. And the problem is if everything they're saying is true, the only real witness is dead,
Yes.
right? The person died, but they're gone. Well, is it in the other side? They have an easier time with their stories because someone's saying, "I'm suffering, I'm suffering." Well, they might be suffering, and maybe they need better care, and that's maybe there is a good
Mm.
way to deal with their pain and symptoms. Absolutely, but they're telling you you're suffering, and you're hearing it. So obviously, that's an easier story to tell
Yes.
than the dead person, where the family is
Yes.
saying, "We're
Because
really upset with what happened to mom, dad,
because
etc."
if if somebody's dead, then they don't complain afterwards.
That's right. Dead people don't talk. It's that simple.
So that's and the cases which have been brought by relatives, and often there has been a question about whether they have legal standing to bring the case.
Right.
You're right about this. I mean, in a way, it's similar um, uh, to suicide prevention, and I think that this, I mean, it's not just it is about suicide
It
prevention.
is about suicide prevention. Yeah.
Um, um, and the problem you have with suicide prevention is that the person the person is their own worst enemy in the situation where they feel overwhelmed. But it is, in one sense, is what they want. In one sense, it's what they don't
Right.
want
That's
it.
exactly right.
It's still it's sort of in their hands. And then, so if you just abandon them to their own thoughts, abandon them to their own actions, then they will take their life. So you need a kind of positive ethos of intervening, whether that intervening is um, um, simply by conversation, or whether it's offering alternatives, or whether in extreme circumstances it's um, having someone detained under mental health law for their own good while they get, say, treatment for depression, which might allow them to see things differently. But you intervene. You don't just take for granted what the person says when the person's in a desperate situation, and we understand this when it comes to other kinds of suicide. But
Right.
um, it's been, this false dichotomy has been brought up in relation to people ending their life in the context where they're also severely ill and they have a life-limiting
Right.
condition and they have disability.
The argument is that regular type suicide is irrational, or someone going through an irrational condition, whereas assisted suicide is about someone who is rational and going through a condition which justifies now the act. Now, it doesn't actually make sense. It's actually a lie. The whole suicide argument that this is, you know, this is an acceptable form of suicide is a lie for many reasons, but the biggest reason comes down to the very basic question. If I were to go walking across a major bridge and I were to see an elderly person with health issues, like a cane and a few other things, looking like they're going to jump off, should I help them over the, to jump? Should I help them, or should I try and protect their life? And if I said, oh, if someone says you should be pushing them off, well, they would say, well, that's a horrific idea. What are you talking about? Well, that's what we're doing here. Someone is saying to their doctor, I want to die. And
It's
now we're
also
going to prescribe them lethal poison.
it's also the case that though having a diagnosis of a terminal disease, say you have a diagnosis of cancer, is a very stressful thing to happen, and it makes people more vulnerable to suicide. Not actually when the symptoms happen, not actually later on, but that first adjustment period that
That's
people
correct.
it is a period of increased vulnerability. Still, um, the vast majority of people, even in Switzerland and even in Canada, the vast majority of people who have a diagnosis of cancer, which is terminal, they die of cancer. They don't die of certainly of unassisted suicide or even of assisted suicide. They because even though it's an extraordinary thing to deal with, people do deal with extraordinary things when they find themselves in such situation. And if you think, I mean, an analogous situation is if somebody faces a criminal conviction, particularly say somebody who's quite respectable, and they're convicted of some crime, whether it's an act of violence or whether it's fraud or whatever it is, and their whole life falls apart, and everything with their reputation is in tatters, and their friends abandon them, and their family abandon them. They are very vulnerable to suicide at that time. I mean, people often, both when they've simply been arrested, but also soon after conviction, people are in an extremely a vulnerable situation. And I'm sure people can think of examples of people who have committed crimes who have committed suicide soon after. One would not want to say that that was a rational thing to do, but you
No,
can understand why people feel overwhelmed, and that's what drives people feel suicide, because their life is kind of taken away, that they thought that they were going to have is taken away from them, and everything seems loose. But one would want to try to get people through that and say, whatever your situation, um, let us try to find things that you can hope in
right.
and live
Absolutely.
for and live through. And that's still true of most people. It's true of most people with disability. It's true of most people with cancer. It's true of most people in prison. It's true of most people who face real crises, that if they're helped through the crisis, then afterwards they can find a way to live. And the normalizing of a wish to die for this subgroup of people, I think, is just it's not only dangerous, it's to me it's unethical and inhumane. It's a contradiction of the traditional role both of medicine, but also more broadly of society and solidarity, of where you see people in trouble, you know.
No, I agree completely. It's sold to us as though autonomy and choice and freedom, and I consider that to be a complete lie, because it's not simply autonomy, choice, or freedom when somebody else is involved with causing your death. That's a
Yeah.
simplification of what autonomy is, or choice, or freedom is.
So this is something I found, and I put this to one or two Canadians who are quite who are in favour of the Canadian law. I say, if it's supposed to be about autonomy, if it's supposed to be, why does nobody do it themselves? Why in Canada, virtually out of 15,000, you have less than 7 who do it themselves.
That's right.
So why is it? And here it seems to me there's a collusion between both the doctor and the patient. Neither the patient wants to do it themselves, nor does the doctor want the patient to do it themselves. They both want the doctor to take the role of taking away the patient's pain. So, and this seems it's so contrary to
Because it's
the
not about
language of
autonomy.
autonomy.
And it can't be about autonomy. When somebody else injects me with lethal poison, that can never be about my autonomy.
Yeah.
It's about somebody else's act. I might have said yes to it, but there's many reasons I might be going through suicidal ideation and want to die. That doesn't make it my autonomy when someone else kills me. Like
Yeah.
euthanasia cannot be autonomy. It's a lie. It's radical autonomy. So why do I call it radical autonomy? Because it's saying, because I might want to die, now society must carry out my death. That's not autonomy. That's not freedom. That's not choice. It's a radical type of autonomy, and it places the responsibility on society and somebody else in order to kill me.
So
It's beyond.
yeah, and I think it's not. It's also, there's something which is disingenuous about it. I think, in that it purports to be about an act of the self. It purports to be about me taking responsibility for my life, for me making my choices, and so on. But it's quite clear that if I'm required to do it myself, then most people wouldn't do it.
Right.
Most people who are euthanized in Canada wouldn't do it if they had to do it themselves.
Correct.
But I'm not saying that I'm in favor of it when they do it themselves, because I also think that, as we've said, suicide prevention should make us try to discourage people from doing it themselves. But if you compare California and Canada, which have similar populations, and in Canada it's 10 times the number, and there are different reasons for that, but one of them is if people have to do it, then fewer people do it. I mean, not only that, but even if you give them the poison and they have it in the cupboard, in about a third of cases they never quite.
Actually, that's not true. I've proven that is not the case. You know, if we can go through the data on that another
Because
time.
people die of other things.
They do die of other things, but there's also, if you look at the data, and I've written a lot about it, you've got this underreporting going on, or likely underreporting going on, and we don't know because there's been no study. You have this whole number every year in the data of deaths that they don't know what happened to them. They
Yes,
received the lethal poison.
I agree.
They did
But
die, but we don't know what happened to them, and there's a huge number of them.
it's still very different from in Canada, where you've
Yeah,
organized the doctor to come, and the doctor comes with their lethal injection kit, and then the doctor gives you your last consent and says, "But do you still want to do it?" And you have what? A fraction of a percent say, "Actually,
right.
no."
And last consent isn't even necessary in our law anymore. Once you're
So
approved, they can kill you on the date they've chosen, and that's just how it goes. We should talk about something else before we come to an end, and that is the changes to the Leadbeater Bill. And the one change that I really think has been not talked about enough, even though it has been talked about significantly, is this whole thing that the original bill said that thered be a judge, even though it wasn't quite a judge, but certainly an appointed person like a judge sort of thing, who would then make the final decision. Yes, this person does qualify, etc. It dealt with the fact that it was a pre-approval process.
yes,
By having a pre-approval process, it deals with the fact that in Canada or in the Netherlands or Belgium, you only look at the death after the person's died, and then they have some committee looking at it, and they're saying, like the Ontario Coroner's Report, 428 deaths that were outside of the rules of the law between 2018 and 2023. 428. Now there could have been more, but they identified 428. But those people, there wasn't a pre-approval process. They're dead already.
yes,
They're dead. So they dealt with that. And then they got rid of that, and they said, no, we're going to have a committee. So they're going to have a death panel. And so I know people went all wild when what's her name, the governor of Alaska, Sarah Palin, talked about death panels. But this is what it is. This is a death panel.
So
And
I
who
think
should
I
be on the
think
death panel?
so when the first vote passed in November, one of the key safeguards, which was an extra safeguard, which, as you say, is not in most jurisdictions, is that it had to go to court, to the High Court. Not
Right,
absolutely clear that it was a High Court judge, but it had to go to the High Court for
right,
approval prior. And then what happened during the committee stage, it became clear that the sheer numbers that they were talking about, even though they were saying, oh, it's only for an exceptional number, the judges said there is no way that we can cope with this. And so instead of a prior court approval, you went to this panel, a review panel, which has echoes of again of Belgium to my mind, or of Australia, which would be essentially a psychiatrist, a social worker, and a QC, a KC, I should say,
yeah,
a lawyer, and they wouldn't be. They would essentially be reviewing, it's a review panel, the decision which had been taken by the two doctors, really the one doctor with a second doctor. So essentially, they're reviewing paperwork. Now
right,
they now have to hear from the patient, which is a step in the right direction, but still that can just be recorded. They don't have to ask any questions. And but the problem I have with this review board system is if you have it as a court, then though we have problems with our courts, I mean, courts are still made of people, they're fallible. People don't join the court for this purpose. So you have a court and you have a variety of
yeah,
people who, whereas what happens when you have a voluntary assisted dying review panel is it attracts people who are not content with the law where it is, who wish to push the law. It
right.
it 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 attracts people like Wim Distelmans. It attracts people like Alan
Oh, and
Weber,
Weeb,
Weeb.
yeah.
These are precisely the people that it attracts. And so
And they don't
rather
want
than,
David Albert Jones on such a committee because that would cause a trouble. So they
well,
wouldn't want
so
him.
some people will join in order to be a spanner in the works, but by and large and on average, they will be self-selecting from a pool of people who have a strong ideological position on this, and so rather than being any kind of inhibitor, it's actually an accelerant, I think.
Yeah,
It,
yeah,
it's it's
I
it's the
agree with you.
worst, and that's why I think, even though there's three people instead of one, I think if you have existing structures and you have to use existing structures, that will may cause problems of conscience for the people in those structures, but you have at least a variety of people. If you set up structures which are review structures, which attract people who want to push the law in a particular direction, then they won't be part of a safeguard. They will be part of pushing it to the next level and to the next stage.
Right, the expansion of law, and that's what we've seen in Canada. Canada's law got expanded in two ways. It got expanded by changing the law, but also it was expanded by the fact that there was no real definition in the law from the beginning. So therefore, certain doctors did euthanasia deaths,
Yeah,
which were not perceived as within the concept of having a natural death being reasonably foreseeable, which was the original part of the law. But by doing that, it gave a license to other doctors to do the same. So you'd have Dr. Weeb and a few others who were active euthanasia
but
doctors who
but
made
but
this
this
their
this
life, and they were
this
doing
this
these
all
deaths.
this also is a pattern in every jurisdiction in Australia and in the Low Countries and in Canada and in the United States, that a small percentage of clinicians are responsible for a large amount of
Yeah,
the actions, and so it's not most physicians don't have anything to do with it, but even those who do, you have a lot of people who just do one or two, and then you have a small number who together do the majority,
right.
and they are then the people who wish to take the practice forward, and they are the people who are on the practitioner boards, who then set the safeguards or whatever, the good standards practice and so on.
That's right.
And that's the problem. It's who guards the guards. And there's nothing in the law in England and Wales which will prevent that from happening. And culturally, everything, I'm afraid, everything in my instinct is that the reasons that Canada has moved so quickly and the reasons that Australia has moved so quickly will also apply in the United Kingdom.
Correct. Yeah, we share one other big factor, and that is the modern failure of our healthcare system.
Yeah.
There's a lot of well, you have a secularization of the culture, but I'm not going to get into that. That's just sort of like, I think there's complete awareness that the culture is very different than it was 50 years ago. I don't have to get into that. We don't have to talk about that. But I do see that the healthcare system is incapable of doing what's expected of it. And so therefore, you have those people who naturally are demanding their right to die, and then you have others who are definitely being pushed into it by a lack of a caring model within the system, and they're dying too. And so, in the beginning, when you're debating this, you're not considering those others, because you're saying, no, 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 it's only going to be for those people who really want this and who
Yes,
have
yes.
these terrible conditions, and we're going to preserve we're going to, protect them from this suffering that they're going to undergo otherwise, because that's the other thing the euthanasia lobby does. They try and create two issues. They say either you have euthanasia and you don't have to suffer, or we don't have euthanasia and you're going to have to suffer. That's how they try and sell it. It's not that, oh, there's multiple options here as to how we can care for you. No,
Yes, yes.
no, you either suffer or not suffer. Anyway, you know what I'm getting to. The fact of it is the healthcare system's in serious trouble in my country, and I know in your country too, and that really does feed the problem even more.
So you wait a year for a hip replacement. You wait 6 months for macular degeneration. By the time you get it, it's already too late. The main users of the healthcare system are people with disability and people who are older. They also face multiple kinds of impediments, discrimination already, and they are very susceptible to being told, actually, there's nothing that we can do for you, meaning
That's right.
nothing that I can do for you now, meaning nothing that we have available. But I can get you on a list in 2 weeks to
That's correct.
for
And,
medical
and
assistance
whereas
online.
I don't believe that we should be pushing all medical treatments on people, there is a time where maybe it's better just
Oh, yeah,
to accept the limits of our life. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with the fact that now that euthanasia is the option, people being told, well, we can we can get it done. We can
yes, yes,
schedule it for Friday afternoon. It's like
yes,
it's
yes.
like it's like having uh something, you have a little growth on your arm, and we can pick that off on Friday afternoon. No, it's just killing you. And that's the other thing that we are so afraid to say. What is this about? This is actually about killing you. You know,
Mhm.
you don't come back from death. Um, there's
But I
spiritual
think
issues
I
that you
think
might
I
want to
think
deal with. That's a whole other question.
I think that what it is, and Professor Trudeau Lemons has, I do think, put his finger right on this. It's the first line of action for the solving of the problem of suffering,
Right.
and ultimately, I think, the problem of death.
Yep.
It's a medical solution to death. Now, there's sometimes a danger in the way that palliative care can be oversold, that people saying, oh, death won't be scary anymore if you have palliative care, and but death is still scary, like marriage is scary, and lots of things in life which are important
Right.
are scary. Um, but um, but more than over-promising, I think that it's the flip side of overzealous treatment.
Yep.
It is thinking that there's a medical treatment for death.
Right.
That means that there is nothing for which we don't have a medical treatment, because we can now have a treatment for all cancers.
Yes. I think we've been talking for a while, and anybody who's going to end up watching this show is going to say, we can do another show another
Yeah,
time.
yeah, yeah.
But anyway, I think this was quite a good discussion. I'm hoping that cooler heads will prevail and enough members of parliament will vote no. And that's our only hope, because the reality
It's
is that
it's
opening the
possible.
door.
It's possible. It takes 28 people to change their minds, or 55 people to stay at home, or something in between. Um, it's not an easy task, because that's 5% of Parliament. But it's 5%. It's not 50% or 20%. You know,
That's right.
so it is possible, and there's been a lot of quite good media attention to some of the problems. But I don't know how much this filters to MPs, and I don't know what MPs will do. But we all are working. I think. I mean, lots of people are working to do our best for something which is still possible to avert.
I agree, absolutely, and that's very important because opening the door, as you know, once the door is opened, it's very hard to shut it, and
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
very hard to keep it from opening further. It's
yeah.
actually, in fact, once you've opened the door, it's impossible to keep it from opening further because then there's other issues called equality and justice you have to deal with. And the argument to me is very correct. If it's okay to kill one person, it becomes very difficult not to be okay to kill the other person with a similar condition.
Yeah.
It's so hard to say once it's okay to kill that it's not okay to kill so and so in that condition.
Though I think for philosophical, political, and theological reasons, one shouldn't say it's impossible. That these things are not like an asteroid hitting the Earth. These are human things which we have created and we can recreate.
Well, I didn't say
It's
it's impossible.
very,
It's
very
very
hard.
difficult to
It's
close
very,
the
very hard
door.
to close the
It's
door.
very hard. But if you're going to open the door, how do you control it? That's as you know, that's just
But also, you're not necessarily the people who open the door are not even going to be in Parliament in 5 years' time to close it. So
no,
it's
that's
not
exactly.
even. I mean, in terms of they themselves have this one, this one chance. And I think that, but just as you look around, it is really, really difficult to push the other way. Northern Territories, they did for a while. They gave them 20 years. Germany, they did in 2015. I only gave them 6 years, but anyway, there was a good law in there. Montana might, and Canada might step back from mental health.
Right. All
So
depending on
it's
what happens
worth
in the
pushing
election.
very hard to stop it opening, and not to say that it's inevitable. But we make things hard for ourselves and dangerous for others if we open this door.
Absolutely. Without a question. Without a question. Thank you so much. And our conversation was excellent. And even though um, your organization has a Catholic background, mine doesn't. It's completely secular. Notice we didn't talk about anything faith oriented or anything like that. So I think that was so to the rest of us, to the rest of the people say, oh, that's just so and so. No, no, no. Actually, the discussion is for everyone. It's for everyone, whether they have a faith background or not. It's for everyone to have this discussion and to recognize that killing people is never, ever a good option. And I always say to people, I'm opposed to killing people. And one of the reasons is I view you as being equal in every way to me. So if I then can kill you, I have then power over you, as well as I believe your life has infinite value. I don't believe it's ever correct to kill you.
Yes.
That's what it comes down to. Always to care, never to kill. Thank you very
Yes.
much.
Thank you very much.